My mother once told me I was worthless, not in anger, not in passing, but in a quiet, deliberate voice after a family meeting where my father announced that my brother Marco would inherit the vineyard I had spent 15 years reviving. "You're just not cut out for leadership," she said. "It's better you accept that now." That sentence broke something in me. I walked away from the family estate that night with nothing but my name, no land, no shares, no recognition. Just dirt under my nails and rage in my chest. They laughed when I bought a barren hillside down the road. They called it Isabella's Folly. But that folly now produces award-winning wines and the Rossi Estate. It's on the brink of foreclosure. Then came the twist I never saw coming. My mother, the same woman who called me useless, showed up at my gate begging for a kidney. If you've ever been underestimated by your own blood, subscribe now. You're not alone. And this story, it's for you. I grew up on the vineyard, not just near it on it. While other kids played video games or rode bikes, I learned to prune vines and test soil pH. By the time I was 16, I could identify a grape's varietal just by its scent. My father, Lorenzo Rossi, used to say, "This land listens only to those who respect it." But somehow that respect was only reserved for my brother Marco. Even when I was the one knee-deep in the fields, logging harvest data, researching sustainable irrigation, Marco was off in Europe learning the art of wine appreciation. That was his excuse, when he returned with a tan and an Italian accent that sounded suspiciously fake. My parents welcomed him like royalty. They praised his charm, his networking, his big-picture thinking. Meanwhile, I was the one meeting with local suppliers, managing payroll, reworking outdated equipment, and putting our estate back into the black. I never expected a trophy, but I thought at the very least I had earned their respect. Then came that fateful dinner. It was supposed to be a simple family meal, wine, pasta, laughter. But halfway through dessert, my father cleared his throat and said, "It's time we talk about succession." I looked at him, then at Marco, then back again. He continued, "Marco will be taking over Rossi Estates effective immediately. Isabella will assist in marketing and operations." Just like that, years of work erased in one breath. I tried to stay composed, but my voice cracked when I asked, "Why?" My father said, "You're too emotional. Isabella leadership requires clarity, not passion." And my mother, she just sipped her wine and said, "You're good at logistics. Support roles suit you better." I left that night. Packed my things, cleared my office, and drove off before sunrise. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just drove. And by the time I stopped, I had made a decision. I was done asking for a seat at their table. I'd build my own. I found it 2 weeks later, a stretch of neglected hillside just outside Calistoga. The soil was dry, the vines long dead, and everyone said it was a terrible investment. But I saw potential, where others saw ruin. I saw rebirth. I named it Phoenix Vines. It felt fitting. I cashed out my savings, took a small business loan, and started over. No family name, no connections, just me, a rented backhoe, and a list of everything they said I wasn't capable of doing. The first year was brutal. Frost took half the cuttings. My hands blistered, my credit score tanked. There were nights I ate instant noodles under a flickering porch light and wondered if I was insane. But every morning I woke up to rows of promise stretching across the horizon. And slowly they grew, the vines thickened, the leaves spread, and I, Isabella Rossi, was still standing by year 3. Phoenix Vines released its first vintage by year 5. Rebirth, our flagship red blend, won gold at the Monterey Wine Festival. Critics said it had the complexity of tradition and the boldness of innovation, and I thought if only my father could taste that. But he never called, neither did Marco. They ignored my success as if it threatened theirs. I wasn't bitter. I had learned something far more valuable than their approval. I had learned to live without needing it. For a while I thought that was the end of it. They had their vineyard, I had mine. Let time sort out who was right. But it didn't stay that clean. Word got around fast in Napa Valley. Phoenix Vines wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Wine distributors who once brushed me off now came knocking. Wine bloggers called me the comeback queen of Calistoga. Some even asked, "Whatever happened to Rossi Estates?" I didn't answer, I didn't need to, but then I started hearing things. That Rossi Estates had fired their longtime vintner, that Marco had replaced half the staff with friends from business school, that he had rebranded the entire line with flashy labels and a new slogan, tradition reinvented. It didn't take long before the cracks began to show. The vines, once carefully rotated and preserved, started producing uneven yields. Marco installed an irrigation system without consulting any viticulturists and flooded half the north field. Longtime suppliers walked away when payments were delayed. The local paper published an op-ed titled, "What Happened to the House of Rossi?" Still, I stayed quiet. That is until one rainy Thursday I found Marco standing at the edge of my vineyard. He looked older, tired, his confidence worn thin. "I need your help," he said. "We're bleeding money, the brand is dying." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean your brand?" He sighed. "Dad's health is fading, he still thinks I can turn it around." "But I can't, you were always the one who understood this land." I didn't reply, I just let the silence do the talking. Eventually he muttered, "Would you consider merging?" I laughed, actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was pathetic. The same people who told me I didn't belong were now asking for a lifeline. I said, "Let me think about it." Then I walked away. A few weeks later, the phone rang again. This time it wasn't Marco. It was my mother. Her voice was different. Smaller. She told me she was sick, stage 4 kidney failure. She needed a transplant, and I was the only match. I froze. Years of hurt, of cold, silences, of biting remarks flooded back all at once. She had never once apologized, never once acknowledged what she said to me that night at the table. But now she wanted my body to save hers. "I'm not calling for me," she said, "I'm calling for your father. He can't lose both his children." That hit a nerve. Both Marco was still alive, still walking, still breathing, but something told me that in her eyes he was already gone. And me, I was a spare part she suddenly needed. I told her I'd call her back, but I didn't. Not that day, not the next. I walked my vineyard tracing the rows with my fingers trying to hear the answer in the wind. Was I really so bitter that I'd let her die? Or had she already killed something inside me long ago? That night I opened a bottle of Rebirth, sat on my porch and stared into the dark. It wasn't revenge I wanted, it was clarity. I wasn't the same woman who begged for validation. I had built something real, something lasting. But maybe, just maybe, the final act of proving my worth wasn't in rejection. It was in showing them what grace really looked like. And so I made a decision I would meet her. On my terms, I told her to meet me at Phoenix Vines, not at a hospital, not at a lawyer's office. But right here on the land, she once said I wasn't good enough to manage. She arrived in a pale blue scarf, fragile in a way I'd never seen before. Thin wrists, sunken cheeks, eyes that darted away when they met mine. I didn't hug her, didn't offer tea, just motioned toward a chair on the patio overlooking the rows of vines climbing the hill. She looked around, lips slightly parted. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "You did all this yourself." I didn't answer. She already knew. After a long pause, she said, "I'm not proud of how things turned out." That was the closest thing to an apology I would ever get, and it wasn't enough. "You said I wasn't fit to lead." I replied that I didn't have what it took. "I was wrong." She said, "I didn't see it then." "You chose not to see it," I said, "because it was easier to believe Marco could carry the family name, even when he didn't care." She looked down at her hands. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, "but I need your help. You're the only match." And there it was. Not redemption, not love, just biology. I stood up and walked to the edge of the patio. From that angle, you could see both properties, Phoenix Vines on the left, and the withering shadow of Rossi Estates on the right. "My terms," I said quietly, "are simple." She looked up. "You transfer full ownership of Rossi Estates to me, all of it, including the name." Her eyes widened. "That land has been in our family for 3 generations. "Then you should have treated it like it mattered," I said. "But instead you handed it to someone who ran it into the ground, and what will you do with it?" she asked. I turned slowly. "I'll restore it, but not for you, not for the Rossi name, for the people who still care about the soil beneath their feet." She went silent, Finally, she nodded, tired, defeated. Maybe she realized this was the price of everything she'd overlooked. I handed her the documents, already drafted, already reviewed. I had called my attorney the moment I agreed to the transplant. She signed with trembling fingers. That night, I checked into the hospital. The surgery was scheduled for the next morning. I lay in the sterile room, hooked to IV lines, watching the ceiling blur. Somewhere down the hall, the woman who birthed me was prepping for surgery too. And yet I felt nothing. Not anger, not guilt. Just a calm, heavy emptiness. Like closing a door that should have never been opened to begin with. The transplant was a success. She would live, but I didn't stay to celebrate. I left the next day. No flowers, no press release, no bedside hugs. I returned to Phoenix Vines with stitches in my side and Rossi Estates in my name. The first thing I did, I walked into the old Rossi tasting room once filled with my father's laughter and Marco's charm, and sat alone. I didn't cry, I didn't smile, I just whispered, "I'm home." But this time on my terms. When I returned to Napa, the sun was rising over the hills, casting gold across the vines like a silent applause. I was sore, bruised, healing. But my mind was clear. I had just given away a part of my body to the woman who once dismissed my entire existence. And in return, I now owned every vine barrel and stone that made up the once proud Rossi Estates. This wasn't revenge. Not exactly, it was reclamation. The first thing I did was visit the Rossi property alone. No cameras, no fanfare. The place was almost unrecognizable. Dead vines, strangled by weeds, broken irrigation lines. The tasting room, once our pride, was silent, its counters dust-covered, its wine racks half empty. I walked every acre, touched every post and wire. And with each step, the ache in my side reminded me I had paid for this. With blood I didn't rush. I made a plan. Step 1. Clean house. I terminated the contracts of every flashy consultant Marco had hired. Gone were the brand strategists with zero understanding of agriculture. Gone were the innovation officers who spent more time on social media than in the soil. Instead, I called back the old vineyard foreman, Luis. He looked surprised when I showed up on his porch with a contract. "They fired me," he said, "and I'm rehiring you." I replied, "But this time we build it right." He signed that night. Step 2. Restore the land. We pulled up the rotting rootstock, tilled the soil, tested the minerals. I brought in the same sustainability practices I had pioneered at Phoenix Vines: solar water pumps, organic pest control, biodynamic crop rotation. It was expensive. It was slow, but it was honest. Step 3. Reclaim the name but redefine it. I didn't want to erase my family. No, I wanted to elevate what Rossi should have been. The new label read, Rossi, a legacy reborn. In small print beneath it, a Phoenix Vines collaboration. Some said it was bold, others said it was cruel, but I didn't do it for them. I did it for every girl who was told she wasn't enough, for every woman forced to prove herself twice as hard just to be treated half as fair. And I did it for me. I reopened the tasting room in spring. No ribbon cutting, no press junket, just a soft launch and a long table set for the vineyard workers, new and old. We poured a test batch of our first revival wine, a delicate Pinot Noir called Second Bloom. Luis took a sip and smiled. "It tastes like forgiveness," he said. I nodded. That's what it's meant to be. Meanwhile, word of the revival began to spread. Old customers returned curious. Distributors who once ignored my calls now asked for exclusives. Even Marco, disgraced and unemployed, showed up one afternoon standing just outside the tasting room. He looked like a man who had finally been humbled. "I just wanted to see it," he said. I didn't invite him in. But I didn't ask him to leave either. Instead, I poured him a glass of Second Bloom and placed it on the railing outside. He took it, drank, nodded slowly, then walked away. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. By fall, sales had doubled. Phoenix Vines was stronger than ever, and Rossi Estates, my inheritance in everything but name, had become a living symbol of what was possible when the right person is finally allowed to lead. I never told anyone about the deal I made with my mother. I didn't need applause or pity. The wine told the story better than I ever could. Each bottle was its own quiet truth, that from bitterness can come balance. And from rejection can come rebirth. The phone rang late one evening in October. It was the hospital. My mother had suffered complications and infection from the surgery. They didn't say it outright, but the tone in the nurse's voice said everything. "You should come. This might be it." I stared at the receiver for a moment, then hung up without replying. For years, I had wanted that woman to acknowledge the pain she caused. Now she lay in a hospital bed with my kidney keeping her alive, still holding on to the same silence she'd always used, like a knife. But I did go, not for her, for me. The room was quiet. Machines hummed and beeped softly. She looked small, pale against the white sheets. When she saw me, her eyes filled not with guilt, not with shame, but something else, something softer, fear maybe, or regret. I sat down without speaking. She whispered, "You didn't have to come." I said, "I know." There was a long pause. Then, to my surprise, she reached for my hand. I wanted to say it before, but I didn't know how I stayed silent. "I was wrong," she said. "About you. About everything." It wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, just quiet, broken honesty. The kind that comes too late, but still matters. I nodded. "Thank you for saving my life," she whispered. "I didn't do it for you." I replied, "I did it so I could live mine without regret." We didn't say goodbye. There was nothing left to say. I left the hospital breathing in the night air, not as someone's daughter, but as someone finally free. That winter, Second Bloom won Best New Vintage at the California Heritage Wine Awards. I didn't attend the ceremony. Luis accepted on our behalf and texted me a picture of the plaque. It read, "Isabella Rossi, for excellence in revival." Funny how the word revival kept finding its way back to me. I celebrated by walking alone through the Rossi Estate. The vines were strong again, green, structured, resilient, much like me. I stopped at the far edge of the property where the old Rossi family sign still stood, faded and cracked, and I made a decision. I had the sign repainted, not replaced, restored with every scar still visible. Beneath the family name, I had 3 words added in gold leaf, led by Isabella: "Not for ego, not for spite, for truth." 2 months later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Marco. It wasn't long, just a single page, but it said everything I needed to hear. "You were always better than me, Isabella. I see that now. I hope one day we can share a table again, not as rivals, but as siblings. I'm working on myself. I don't expect forgiveness, just a chance to rebuild like you did. Love, Marco." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of my desk, not ready to reply. But not ready to throw it away either. Some roots, if you give them time, might still take hold. Spring came early in Napa. The air was crisp, the hills green with promise. I stood beneath the archway of the newly reopened Rossi tasting room. Guests laughed and clinked glasses. A young couple asked for a bottle of Rebirth, not knowing the irony behind its name. And in that moment I realized this wasn't just my vineyard anymore. It was a place where pain had been planted, but healing had grown, not out of revenge, not out of bitterness, but out of patience and quiet, relentless truth. I had turned the ashes they left me into wine, and it was good. People ask me sometimes if I've forgiven my mother, and the honest answer: I don't think forgiveness is always a clear moment. It's not a single word or a grand gesture. Sometimes it's just choosing to let go of what you'll never get back and deciding to live fully anyway. What I know is this: I don't wake up angry anymore. I don't replay her words in my head at night. I've built something I'm proud of, with my own hands on my own land, and that peace, it's enough. As for Marco, we've exchanged letters slowly, cautiously. There's no perfect reunion, no neat ending, but there's space. And sometimes that's all you need to start again. I walk the vineyards now with a different rhythm, not chasing approval, not fighting for a seat at a table that was never meant to include me. Instead, I walk as someone who knows exactly who she is without needing anyone else to say it out loud. I used to think revenge was about making people pay, but now I understand real revenge is becoming everything they said you couldn't be, and then not needing their validation at all. Phoenix Vines and Rossi Estates now operate together under a single banner, not as proof that I won, but as proof that I endured. Because sometimes the greatest triumph isn't in the victory itself. It's in surviving the fire and still choosing to grow.